So let's get started then. Just want to welcome everyone to the monthly meeting for Common Ground for Texans, and welcome to our very first ever Zoom meeting. My name's Mike Ignatowski. I'm a board member on Common Ground for Texans, and I'll be your host today. This is an experiment for all of us, so please bear with us. We'll do our best to keep this informative and entertaining, and hopefully not experience too many technical problems along the way. We can't, unfortunately, provide you with coffee and cookies today, but feel free to treat yourself with whatever snacks and whatever beverages you care to indulge in during this afternoon's meeting. Common Ground for Texans promotes positive solutions through civil engagement. We're a nonpartisan group advocating informed citizen participation in all the issues of the day. We often have panels discussions, bringing in people from various different viewpoints on various topics. But today we are thrilled to welcome our single guest, Professor Michael Lind from the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. Professor Lind will be discussing the history of polarization in America. What brought us to today's polarization? Is today's climate unique? And what does the future hold in store for us? The format today will be fairly similar to what we normally do, except that instead of a panel, I'll be asking Michael Lind a number of questions, and you'll be hearing him hopefully do most of the talking. Everyone else will be on mute in the meantime. And then after that discussion, we will open it up for questions from the audience. And if you want, you can open up the little chat window. There's always a button on the bottom of the screen that says chat, and type in your questions there. They will go to Hamilton Richards, and he will basically curate them and help select the questions in the order that we ask of our speaker today. So without any further ado, let me go to Michael Lind to introduce him. He is, as I said, a professor at University of Texas. He has written a number of books, including this latest one that just came out this year, I believe, The New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite. Professor Michael Lind, can you tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to write the book today?
Well, my background is I have deep roots in Austin in Central Texas. I'm a fifth-generation native of the Austin area. One of my ancestors was an actual cowboy, went on cattle drives to Kansas. Another was a German Jewish immigrant in the U.S. cavalry who came to Austin when it was occupied by Reconstruction forces after the Civil War. So a lot of my, and I went to the University of Texas at Austin, went to Yale for graduate school. From there, I worked briefly in the State Department during the Gulf War. My initial focus was on foreign policy. I then went to the National Interest, a Foreign Policy Quarterly, in the early 1990s. From there to a career as a journalist, as a staff writer at the New Yorker, Washington editor of Harper's Magazine, a New Republic editor. And in 1999, I co-founded New America, a nonpartisan think tank, which is still going strong in Washington, headed by Anne-Marie Slaughter, former head of policy planning in the Obama State Department. So one of my concerns throughout my career in writing about, I've written about a lot of domestic politics in American history, is common ground. Like I like to ask my students, what is the purpose of democracy, and go through different definitions. There's the idea that it should express the will of the majority. There's the idea that it should be a process that leads to the technically best policy result. And I make the case for my own answer, which is the purpose of democracy is to avert civil war. It's to have ballots instead of bullets. Even if that doesn't mean the best expertise-informed policy all the time, and even if it means sacrificing majority opinion sometimes to in your national community. So I commend your group and your cause of promoting common ground, both as a Texan and as someone who has been thinking about how do you promote common ground for most of his career.
Okay, so great. I love that definition of democracy, a way to avoid civil war. Some people say it's also a way to remove really bad rulers too. One of the benefits.
Short of civil war.
Civil war.
Fascination, you know, there was a debate at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and there was a move to make the president infinitely re-electable. And Benjamin Franklin said, well, then occasionally assassination would be necessary. So it went ahead, but then after Franklin Roosevelt's 4 terms, of course, they changed the Constitution to prevent presidents for life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what are you focused on now? Or
well, I'm kind of in a pandemic shortened book tour. Fortunately, and if I can use Zoom to advertise my book.
Oh, please do.
From Penguin, The New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite. But I got great coverage, you know, in January and February. It's published in January and denounced in some quarters, praised in others, but covered in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, New Yorker, most of the major political journals. The subject of the book is the populist movements that we see that led to Trump in the US, to Brexit in Britain, to various other phenomena on both sides of the Atlantic. I argue that Western Europe and the US and North America are similar enough you can make generalizations. That's not true of Eastern Europe, in my opinion. It's not true of East Asia, but I think the US and the EU are fairly similar. And my argument is that it's a backlash against a tendency towards consolidation and a less and less inclusive political system along class lines, not along gender and race diversity lines, but along class lines, which we don't like to talk about over the last half century. So I criticize the populists, what I call demagogic populism. I argue that is usually ineffectual and leads to failure. It doesn't lead to fascism. Fascism is a completely different interwar European phenomenon. But so the main problem with populism is it's just ineffectual charlatans. I criticize the opposite of populism, which is that of our centrist establishments on both sides of the water. I call it technocratic neoliberalism. And I argue for a new pluralism, the model of which is the New Deal in the United States, the New Deal order between the 1930s and the 1970s, and what political scientists call the post-war social settlements in Europe, and what those social settlements and the New Deal had in common. It was not just that they had representative electoral politics, that's very important, but outside of electoral politics, they had power-sharing institutions. So you had systems of tripartite government, business, labor cooperation where businesses were more or less pressured or required to engage in collective bargaining with unions in major sectors. You had informal kind of power sharing in the cultural educational realm where very powerful, usually religious institutions, had ways of making their views known. Now, you may not agree with those views, but you know, as I say, democracy is not to have a homogeneous opinion. It's to avert civil war. So I argue in the New Class War that a lot of those institutions that represented particularly working class people of all races and various religions have just gotten weaker and weaker. And the consequence is a political system in the US, but also in Europe, where people like me, college-educated professionals born to college-educated professionals, we really pretty much run everything. We you know, sort of dominate. We have vastly more social power power in the economy, power in the media, power in the political system than the equivalents did, 40, 50 years ago in the New Deal era.
There was a quote I read, I believe it was from you, that compared the populist reaction to what happens when you keep putting money in a Coke machine, nothing comes out.
Yeah, I argued that if well, maybe I'm giving myself away. If you keep putting quarters in a Coke machine and no Coke comes out, you're tempted to kick it and bang on it, right? I mean, I, of course, would never do such a thing, but that this is a common reaction. And indeed, this is what you see as the parties, all parties have declined as mass membership organizations in the US and Europe over the last few decades, and have become much more essentially brands, which can be bought by individuals or well-financed factions. What you see is many of the working class voters, and again, this is not just the white working class, it's people of all races, either they simply stop voting and they become very disengaged from the political system, or now and then they seize on protest candidates like Trump or protest movements like Brexit, and are they really endorsing policies? I'm not so convinced they are. I think it's more like throwing a rock through the window or kicking the Coke machine.
Yeah. And it's easy to kick things down, but.
Well, Sam Rayburn, my fellow Texan, the head of the Speaker of the House for much of the 20th century, had a great line. He said, any jackass can kick down a barn, takes a carpenter to build one.
Yeah. I love that line. So let's step back from your current book for a moment and talk a little bit about history. The common question people often ask is, are we in a unique era of polarization now? Or are we in the type of thing that's been more common throughout our history? Would you talk about that?
Well, there's what was called the consensus school of history. People like Arthur Schlesinger and others after World War II, Richard Hofstadter. And they argued that the US has always had this philosophical middle-of-the-road consensus since the American Revolution. The earlier generation that they were reacting against were the progressive historians, not progressive in the modern sense of center-left, but of, like the 1900s, like Charles Beard, who emphasized conflict in American history. And I've always been much more influenced in my own work and my own thinking about US history by the conflictual school. That is, you have, deep divisions along regional lines, class lines, racial and ethnic and religious lines. The US periodically breaks down and we rebuild a new country, or at least the victors in some sort of civil war crisis build a new country. And then we pretend there's this continuity there, when in fact there is not. Really, it's the country in that sense does not really go all the way back to 1776 or the Constitution to 1787. We're just less honest about the discontinuities than the French are, right? Because they're now in their fifth republic, and they've had several empires, a directory, a fascist regime, and 5 republics. And they're just quite honest, that they periodically change their form of government. There's an old joke about an American who goes to a Parisian bookseller and asks for a copy of the French Constitution. And the very haughty Parisian bookseller says, "We do not sell periodic literature." So in my first book, The Next American Nation, I argued, and this was not original with me, people like Bruce Ackerman of Yale, others have used similar formulas and with different details, but I argued that we're in the third republic of the United States. That is, the first republic was a very shaky, largely agrarian regime dominated by Southern slave owners that broke down in the Civil War. The Second Republic was assembled by Lincoln and his heirs, a Northeastern Midwestern coalition of industrialists and family farmers in the Midwest. And that succumbed to terminal crisis in the Great Depression. And so Franklin Roosevelt became the de facto founder of the Third Republic, which we're now living, in my view, in the final cataclysmic stages. And it will be succeeded by a Fourth Republic. I hope it's a republic. I hope it's not a first empire or a first consulate or a first directory or something else from Roman history. So I do think, why would you be surprised that, and this is true of other countries too, it's true of, every country in the world. I think in my book, Land of Promise, An Economic History of the United States, I looked at the underlying technological and economic and demographic factors that drive this. So I don't think it's just a battle of ideas. In fact, in Land of Promise, I correlated this three republic schema with the first industrial revolution based on steam power, with the second industrial revolution based on motorization, electric batteries and internal combustion engine. And now we're shifting in the economy. We're on Zoom to this information-based digital industrial revolution, which is just getting started. We haven't really had the advances we expected in robotics and AI, but that's coming. And you just naturally, there's a lag, in my view, between the social and economic and political institutions, the structures inherited from the past, and these new innovative technologies, which kind of destabilize everything. And at some point, there's just a crash, and then you cobble together. It's not done by geniuses according to some master plan. It's improvised, but whatever the new improvised system is, that lasts for a couple of generations, and then it becomes obsolete. So the good news is we can all be founders, right? We don't have to revere these bewigged, buckle-shoed 18th century gentlemen the way a lot of conservatives do. It's, if you wait long enough, the system will crash, and you can be a founder too.
I'm fascinated by this idea that we, on a regular basis, disassemble part of our community and our society and rebuild something new. And that's sure sounds appealing as a description of what we're doing now.
Things are always falling apart and growing, right? And if you're sort of pessimistic conservative, if you look at what's deteriorating, and if you're an optimistic liberal, if you look at what's green shoots, there's no joke about conservative Southerners. How many Southern conservatives does it take to replace a light bulb? And the answer is 5. 1 to replace the light bulb, 4 to talk about how great the old light bulb was.
Oh dear. Let's get back to where we're headed in a few minutes. There is a feeling of many people our age that while polarization has always been with us, it has gotten worse since roughly the end of the Cold War. Is that true? And if so, why do you think that's happening?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt about it. And to the extent that I bring a somewhat original approach to this, I think there are 2 rings of institutions that dampen down polarization, not just one. So the inner wing, the one we must think about, and I've spent a lot of my career on this, is the actual territorial political system. That is, it's voting, it's parties, right? It's how popular preferences and values are structured through the electoral system. And back in 1992, I helped co-found a Fair Vote organization that was founded largely by Rob Ritchie and by John Anderson, the late John Anderson, which many of you know about, promoting electoral reform. So that's the political system. And it makes a big difference, as we can discuss, not only what your electoral rules are, but do you have strong parties, do you have weak parties, all these variables make a difference. However, I would add to that, that's not enough necessarily, because there are some social cleavages which even the best designed electoral political party system just cannot accommodate by themselves. And that's why I emphasize in the new class war what I call pluralist power structures, things like unions, collective bargaining, kind of input from different groups on media policies, on educational policies. And this is outside of the elected officials by themselves, right? So, so for example, in the economy, you need some kind of power sharing between employers and employees. Since there really is no such thing as a labor market, this is a academic fiction. Individual workers have next to no bargaining power with their employers. So you have to have some kind of institutionalized negotiations. And if both of these fail simultaneously, and I think this is what has happened in the US, if you have a bad political system, bad electoral system, and ordinary electoral politics, and these intermediate power sharing institutions have crumbled too, you know, then you're in real trouble. And I think that's where we are.
Are there any specific personalities or events or trends like globalization that you would point out as being particular to increasing what has happened since the end of the Cold War that has increased the polarization?
Yeah, I think globalization itself has. And as I write in my book, globalization, the way it has been described in the mainstream elite press, and I say this as a former New Yorker staff writer and Washington editor of Harper's, and executive editor of the National Interest, bears no resemblance to the reality. You know, 90% of globalization is actually not trade. It's not based on comparative advantage among nations. It's based on arbitrage. And this is a concept that may be familiar to some people. With economics background, arbitrage means you have different jurisdictions, okay? And you as the investor or you as the corporation move assets back and forth in order to exploit differences in prices or in taxes or in labor costs among these jurisdictions. So when the governor of Texas goes to California, Rick Perry, and says, you know, move your firms to Texas. We have lower wages and lower taxes and lower regulations, and the firms do it. They are exploiting arbitrage, right, within the system. Well, the same is true. We've discovered now in this pandemic that 80% of all American drugs and their drug precursors come from two countries, China and India. Well, that was not the case 30, 40 years ago, right? So why did...
And the reason that's happening is why?
Cheap labor. And in the case of China, it's not just cheap labor, it's government subsidies to multinational corporations. And the same is true with India in a different way. India has its developmental model, and I'm not criticizing the Chinese or Indians. The United States broke all kinds of free market rules when it was developing up until 1945. So developing nations, you know, tend to have industrial policies to lure foreign investment and to try to transfer technology. That's their right. But in the case of China, it's not just low wage, unfree labor that can't be unionized because free unions are illegal. It's an authoritarian state. But it's also they'll build infrastructure for your company. They'll train exactly the sort of technicians you need. You know, so if you're just looking at the bottom line as a US corporation, then why would you negotiate with these well-paid Americans who belong to unions, you know, in Detroit or wherever? Why not, you know, move it to China? And so that's what they did, you know, following the bottom line. But the result is, and also immigration is a factor. The press, there seems some law to say that the labor market exists in terms of you know, effects of workforce size on wages, except for immigration. That is, all immigration is good. It has no side effects. There are no costs and benefits. Well, I'm sorry, that's just ideology. You know, you can be as pro-immigrant as you want, but if you flood the local labor market with a group of new workers, and the jobs have not expanded simultaneously and magically, right? Then you've got a loose labor market, and employers always prefer loose labor markets to tight labor markets. Conversely, workers want too many employers chasing too few workers. That gives the workers leverage. So there's always been a class conflict in immigration built in. That's why organized labor in the US, the African-American community and others historically wanted more restrictionist immigration policies than the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers. This goes back 200 years. So basically globalization, and it's not limited to labor arbitrage. That is, trying to get the cheapest possible labor, whether it's overseas or you bring in immigrants willing to work for less than natives. It's also tax arbitrage, right? We in recent years, Apple parked most of its profits in Ireland to hide them, and then when the U.S. cracked down on that, they moved them, to other offshore tax havens like the Cayman Islands and Panama, and the Jersey Islands, which are a tax haven between the UK and France in the English Channel. There's regulatory arbitrage, where if you tighten environmental regulations in the US, fine, just shut down your factory and move it to Mexico if they're, unenforceable environmental regulations. So now, and that what this means is, and it's hard for a lot of progressives in particular to deal with this. There are racist reasons to oppose immigration. There always have been. There are racists who oppose offshoring, but there are legitimate concerns about the effects of both offshoring and immigration on labor markets, and particularly offshoring of manufacturing. As I note in my book, The New Class War, if you look at the geographic concentration of populist votes in the US, in Britain, in France, in Germany, and other countries, there's a high correlation between the deindustrialized manufacturing regions were hit the hardest by imports, not only of Chinese companies, but also of German and American and Japanese corporations, that had set up offshore processing plants in China. David Autor, the economist, and some of his colleagues showed that in the American Midwest, there was a direct correlation in 2016 between the severity of import competition from China and the willingness of voters to support either Donald Trump or, guess who? Bernie Sanders, right? So trade in particular, not so much immigration, because at this point, there is not that much direct competition between native white working classes, who are the base for populism, and immigrants, for the very simple reason that immigrants are concentrated in cities where rich people live.
What you're describing to me sounds like the buildup of some of the frustrations that led to populism. But I also want to get back to the polarization aspect of this and what has been happening in the last few decades since the end of the Cold War. And are there any other, let's go to personalities or other events that may have been contributing to this?
Well, I think personalities tend to express underlying forces or to exploit them. They don't necessarily create them. I think a critical personality was the late Ross Perot, because what you've seen in the US is elite neoliberals who are more or less moderate libertarians. That is, they're not radical libertarians. There's some function for the government, but basically, they prefer to have privatized things than have the government do it. They ended up dominating both wings of both of the two American parties from the 70s to the 80s. If you look at the Democratic Party, power shifted from the AFL-CIO, which had been the strongest power in the Democrats during the New Deal era, to the so-called New Democrats like Bill Clinton and Al Gore. And Barack Obama was a New Democrat, basically inherited that whole system. And its base was not the manufacturing labor unions, which it had been in the past, but it was a coalition of Wall Street, Silicon finance billionaires with in Los Angeles, the entertainment industry, with public sector unions, who were the remaining unions. Private sector unions, pretty much, their members have tended to vote for Republicans for some time. At the same time, in the Republican Party, there was a populist wing, often very nasty, represented by Patrick Buchanan. That was defeated by the Libertarians, who actually don't share that much in terms of policy. They're not that different, the Bush Republicans, from the Clinton Democrats. They agree on, they have very benign view of globalization, very high levels of unskilled immigration. Even the Democratic neoliberals are indifferent at best to private sector unionization. They tend to preach, more skills training, sending more people to college and so on. They don't talk a whole lot about collective bargaining anymore, unlike the Democrats of my youth. So essentially, in my view, both parties were captured pretty much by this same kind of worldview, this neoliberal, pro-globalization, kind of pro-privatization worldview. And they differed on sex and abortion and affirmative action and very inflammatory racial issues. But on actual economic policies, they weren't that different. And Perot was kind of the first early warning sign of this. And people didn't pay attention because he got 19% of the popular vote, which was the highest percentage. He didn't get any electoral votes, as I recall, because of the way our system's designed. But that was the highest since Theodore Roosevelt ran as the Independent Progressive Party candidate in 1912. So, and Trump didn't come out of nowhere in 2015. In 2000, he and his friend Jesse Ventura, who they knew each other through TV wrestling, being the wrestler and Trump being the impresario, they teamed up and they tried to take over Ross Perot's Reform Party, which Perot had created as a vehicle for his candidacy. And they fought. They were actually on the left wing of the Reform Party. The right wing was Patrick Buchanan and David Duke, the former head of the Ku Klux Klan. And the Buchanan and Duke won. Ventura and Trump were driven from the Reform Party. Trump published a half-page ad in the New York Times denouncing this neo-Nazi Buchanan and this Klansman, and I actually when I lived in New York, I came across Trump's campaign book that he wrote in anticipation of being the Reform Party candidate in 2000. And it's fairly center-left stuff. I mean, he was kind of, moderate New York, New Jersey Democrat most of his career.
Do you remember the name of that book?
I don't remember. It's on Wikipedia somewhere, I'm sure. Huh. He wanted a Canadian-style national health care system, things like that. I mean, he's an opportunist. He's a demagogue. Yeah. But so there's a direct line from Perot through the Reform Party, and of that faction, thank God we haven't had President Duke or President Buchanan, but Jesse Ventura went off to become a one-term governor of Minnesota as a protest candidate. And then Trump, we will see if he's a one-term protest candidate president.
So many people are probably wondering why you did not mention Newt Gingrich and Rush Limbaugh.
Oh, well, I see them as part of the establishment. I was talking about Perot and the protesters. Okay. Now,
but in terms of promoting polarization.
Oh, yeah. So if you want to look at polarization, in my view, it was the Republicans bear the primary responsibility in the 1990s for this, although I think the Democrats recently, and it's just been just as appalling with Nancy Pelosi ripping up the president's speech in front of the cameras and calling the Senate Majority Moscow Mitch and accusing him of being a Russian spy. She's despicable. I mean, she's as bad as Gingrich in terms of polarization. But the institutional ways that the Republicans initially polarized our system were two. One was imposing party discipline on the committee chairs in the House of Representatives. This is something Newt Gingrich did. He admired the British parliamentary system, where essentially you centralize all power in the leadership, right? Everybody else is very weak. And you have very strong party discipline. Everybody has to vote party line vote. That had not been the case in the US since the early 1900s, when Joe Cannon, who was the Speaker of the House from a New England state, I don't remember which state he was, Republican, they were dominant at the time, was known as Tsar Cannon, after the Russian Tsar, autocratic Speaker of the House. And there was a rebellion in the House of Representatives, and they weakened the Speaker and they decentralized power to committee chairmen. Now, they did this at a time when it was a Republican majority. Now, when the Democrats took over under Franklin Roosevelt and dominated Congress for half a century, it turned out to benefit very reactionary Southern members of Congress from safe one-party Dixiecrat seats. And so there was an initial rebellion in among the Watergate babies of the 1970s. This new generation of baby boomer Democrats, including Gary Hart, to weaken the seniority system, to give the House leadership on the Democratic side more of a say in appointing committee chairs. But this really only came to fruition under Gingrich, where you centralized power in the office of the Speaker of the House. And I think Pelosi has followed this, as we've seen. The other innovation that the Republican Party introduced, which has been very bad for our system, was what was called the Hastert Rule under Dennis Hastert, when he was briefly Speaker of the House. And what that meant was, unless a majority of the caucus, that is, of the majority party in the House, supported a bill, there wouldn't be a vote on it, right, on the House floor. And that was not always the case, right? Because particularly during the period from the 1930s up until the 1990s, we had a de facto four-party system in the US. The two major parties were very weak. The four actual parties were liberal Northern Republicans, who were often well to the left of the reactionary Southern Democrats, the Bourbon Democrats or Dixie Democrats, the segregationists. You had the sort of farmer labor Democrats who were more populist and egalitarian. And then you had some conservative Republicans in the Northeast who were very right-wing, and in the Midwest as well, but they were quite different from your rural Southern landlord, Bourbon Democrats. They were more the reactionary small business types who didn't like the New Deal. So that allowed shifting coalitions between Franklin Roosevelt, who was supported on some measures by Northern progressive Republicans and then opposed by reactionary Southern Democrats. Same was true of the Civil Rights Revolution. More Republicans, as a percentage of their party, voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 than Democrats because of the very strong segregationist Democratic wing. And Lyndon Johnson worked with Northern Republicans to try to thwart the Southern segregationist members of his own party. And partly because of this Gingrich and Hastert attempt to create really disciplined, centralized party system in our system, this has returned us to the levels of polarization that existed in the decade leading up to the Civil War, but also in the 2 or 3 decades following the Civil War. Look, as a champion of electoral reform, I think we need a multi-party system. That is, I think that most Americans are not Democrats or Republicans. We have these two parties because of our plurality electoral system, as many of your members know, and we can discuss that later. But if you can't have proportional representation rules creating a multi-party system, then the next best thing is the system of 1950 or 1960, where the party leaders in the House and Senate are weak, where the parties are not disciplined, where the actual parties are kind of caucuses or factions, of which there are more than 2. And then they're willing to deal with each other across their nominal partisan lines on major issues. And I think if we had a more flexible system like that, we'd be in a different place today.
Time is really flying here. I wanted to make sure we cover some other topics of current day interest too. And certainly in the last maybe 2 weeks, COVID-19 response seems to have been getting increasingly partisan. Do you have any thoughts on that and where that will lead?
Well, at the very beginning of this, at April 1st, my LBJ school colleague, Jamie Galbraith, eminent economist, and I in the Boston Globe, we published an op-ed calling for a version of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which existed throughout the New Deal. It was actually created by Herbert Hoover and then expanded by Franklin Roosevelt, and headed by legendary Texas businessman Jesse Jones. And it provided, it was a nonprofit government corporation that was more or less nonpartisan, and it supervised much of the mobilization of the economy to fight World War II. And we argued this was the model you want to have, partly in order to prevent partisanship, right? You don't want the electoral branches making decisions about who gets ventilators, where all the money is going and so on. So our proposal got some attention before he dropped out of the presidential race. Bernie Sanders endorsed a version of it. In practice, we've gone a different route, which rather than creating a temporary nonpartisan agency to head up mobilization, we're doing this through the ordinary executive branch, which is controlled by the Trump administration, of course. Also through the somewhat nonpartisan Federal Reserve. And when it came to finance, we argued that having a health finance corporation, which is what we called our agency, it could raise its own money outside of Congress by issuing bonds. You wouldn't have to go back to Congress every couple of weeks. Well, the powers that be in this country have decided no. We're just going to go back to Congress every 2 or 3 weeks. We'll pass a huge TARP-like bailout, as in 2008. The TARP was the big troubled assets relief program. And then when that turns out not to be working, then we'll pass another multi-billion-dollar bailout. And in between, Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve will decide what companies to bail out. And as we've discovered now, there's a rather depressing article in Politico today. Jared Kushner and Mike Pence are essentially deciding, who gets ventilators, right? And this would happen if it were a Clinton administration, if you were doing this through the ordinary political appointee system, which is why we argued you needed, some kind of separate temporary emergency agency, right? Where just, having the phone number of somebody at the White House, is not the way you get personal protective equipment. I'm now the good news about this is, as Winston Churchill observed before the U.S. entered World War II, the Americans can be counted upon to do the right thing when they've exhausted all of the alternatives. So by trial and error, even with Jerome Powell and Jared Kushner and Nancy Pelosi and so on, I don't think this is the most effective way to do the response. But even this response, they are learning by trial and error. So initially, the premise was that companies would just fire people, and then they would go on unemployment insurance. And then other countries, including Denmark and Britain, had a better idea, which was to keep these companies on these employees on payroll and just furlough them, and then the government would pay for that. And then so Congress came up with a payroll retention program, which has done some good. It could be expanded. And I don't want to idealize governments in the past. If you look at the Civil War, the first couple of years, the Lincoln administration was kind of floundering around and, finding generals, firing them before they settled on a good strategy and a great commander, Ulysses S. Grant. If you look at the Roosevelt administration during World War II, defense production, every 6 months, he just disbanded the committee. It wasn't working, created a new one. before finally settling on the RFC. So this crisis, I think you have to be somewhat generous in evaluating this, because it's like a stress test on all forms of human government, regardless of what they are, whether it's communist dictatorship in China, authoritarian, state in Russia, various kinds of democracy in Europe and Latin America. And it turns out, Aristotle studied different kinds of constitutions. Turns out really there's no constitution that works well in a pandemic.
It is interesting to look at this as a grand experiment, not even between countries, but also between states in terms of what they're doing. And it seems like a bipartisan emergency commission to look at this is such an obvious idea. If anyone from Common Ground can find a link to that and post it to everyone in the chat room, that would be great. It was the article you wrote with Galbraith in Boston Globe?
Galbraith, yeah, in the Boston Globe. On the Health Finance Corporation, that's what we called it.
Health Finance Corporation. Okay. One last question before we start opening it up to questions from the audience. We did put in the title of this, a discussion of where we're going in the future. And I'd like you to finish off here with your thoughts about where we are headed in the coming decade or so. You talked about being on the verge of the Fourth Republic for the country, which is a fascinating idea. I'm sure a lot of people are interested in that. Would you care to expound on that a little bit more and how you see this developing now?
As I said at the beginning, I see U.S. history as kind of the construction of regimes that for a couple of generations benefit certain groups rather than others, collapse in some crisis. Usually the underlying problem is technological change and economic change have outpaced social and political reform, and there's a sudden abrupt shock that brings this into view. The next republic doesn't necessarily be better than the one that preceded it. It can be worse. The first republic of the United States was really nothing to brag about. It was pretty horrible. I mean, from 1789 up until 1861, it was congenitally flawed by the veto power imposed by the southern slave states. It nearly fell apart in the 1820s and the 1830s and the 1850s. Civil war was narrowly averted in basically every decade over the same issue, slavery, which was not just slavery, it was also plantation economics versus industrialization and free farming in the North and so on. So it's quite possible. I do think a new system will emerge in the US by 2020. Now, it will still be called the United States of America. We will still have exactly the same written constitution we have now. It needn't be amended, but it will be a different country. I mean, it will be a different political system. It will be a different social order, and it could be better or it could be worse.
You said by 2020, you meant?
2030.
2030. Yeah, certainly there's a lot of discussion about whether or not the technologies of social media and mass data collection have kind of outrun the ability for society to adopt to them. But boy, that's a whole nother topic. Are we ready to open this up for some questions from the audience now?
Yeah, okay. So the first question is, how much direct conflict is there in terms of employment between illegal immigrants and citizens? I've heard that illegal immigrants typically take jobs that citizens won't take, and when there are raids and those jobs open up, they're typically not then filled by citizens.
Yeah, well, that's the party line of the U.S. establishment. It's false. And I've studied the history for 30 years. There was no point at which American gardeners, maids, nannies, drywall contractors simply threw down their tools and quit. And then we went for months or years without having any construction workers or any people working in meat packing. That's absurd. This is propaganda by the employer lobby. So what actually happened is, let's go back before this wave of present immigration began in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The US had very low immigration between the 1920s, when it was cut off by actually racist and nativist quotas. I wouldn't defend those, from the 1924 system to the 1965 Act, which struck them down, which I think was one of the great reforms of US history. Got rid of this racist and nativist quota system. But during that period, houses were built, right? Babies were taken care of. Even though immigrants were a negligible share of the population, they shrank during that period, and wages were never higher. So when you look at any country where the workforce is largely immigrant, there was a low-wage immigrants. I'm not talking about high-wage immigrants. Let's factor that out. Okay, so the computer technicians, doctors, that's a different subject. I'm talking about the basic low-wage trades. Let's say meatpacking. Meatpacking was a unionized industry with decent wages and benefits in the 50s and 60s and 70s. It is now a non-unionized, low-wage industry filled largely by fairly recent immigrants who are so desperate that they will take these terrible jobs. So what actually happened was the availability of a pool of desperate workers who were non-union workers who were willing to work for lower wages and in more dangerous conditions than most American workers. Over time, that allowed sleazy employers in these industries like meatpacking, this has been documented, you can look it up, to gradually phase out the native workforce in favor of this much more poorly paid, non-unionized, exploited workforce. You can look this up in the case of the janitors in Los Angeles. In the 60s and 70s, janitors in Los Angeles were disproportionately African American. They were unionized. They had decent wages. The employers in Los Angeles used the illegal immigrant workforce to replace them and to crush the unions. So when somebody says Americans won't do these jobs, you know, you got to just laugh. This is propaganda by the employers' lobbies and by libertarians. Does that mean you have to be anti-immigrant? Well, no, you have to distinguish individual immigrants who should be treated as well as US citizens, welcome to the country, but obviously numbers matter. There's a reason why Forward.us, the pro-immigration advocacy group that is founded by Mark Zuckerberg, is funded mostly by large corporations. They hate unions. They don't like paying Americans high wages. And in the case of Silicon Valley, I have friends who are Indian H-1Bs. Another lie is the claim that America is not producing enough scientists and engineers for these jobs. Therefore, we have to import these educated, highly knowledgeable and skilled immigrants from India and China. And I say India because 70% or so of the H-1B jobs, these are non-visa immigrants in Silicon Valley who make up a substantial part of the tech workforce, are not only from India, they're from 2 states in India. I don't remember the names of the 2 states. So it's, it is not the case that there would be no Silicon Valley without foreign-born workers. Silicon Valley was developed in the 40s and 50s and 60s when there was almost no immigration. The reason why the H-1B visa in particular is appealing to these sleazy corporations, and I use sleazy in a technical sense, is that these are called these are not actually immigrants, all right? They're indentured servants. These are called non-immigrant visas. Now, what does that mean? It means if you get an H-1 visa, you're an Indian national, you go to work for, Apple or Microsoft in Austin or San Francisco, you cannot apply for a green card. Number one. Number two, so you can't apply for citizenship while you're working, for Google in Austin. What's more, you You can't quit your employer without going back home to India or another country. I mean, that's indentured servitude. My great-grandmother in Austin was an indentured servant from Sweden for 7 years. At least at the end of that time, she could become apply for the US citizenship. But this is even more exploitative than that. If your boss fires you, then you have to go back to your home country. Now, some benevolent employers allow their serfs, which is basically what these indentured servants are, to get green cards and apply for citizenship, but they've lost an enormous amount of time. Let's say you were an H-1B, and I know cases like this personally, where, and these were college-educated professionals, mostly from Asia. So their H-1B is periodically renewed. They can live in the US for 20 years and not apply for citizenship, which then takes an additional 5 years to get citizenship once you're on the track with the green card. So you know, maybe if you have a benevolent boss, they'll give you a green card. And then they'll, 5 years later, look, we need to, as I propose in my book, the way to deal with the economic effects of immigration is to thwart the employer lobbies in two ways. One, we grant an immediate unconditional amnesty with a rapid path to citizenship for most illegal immigrants who are long resident here. And that allows them to become citizens, to vote, to join unions, and it makes them less attractive to employers now because the employers have lost this leverage over them. The other thing you do is you just get rid of these guest worker programs, except maybe for a few cases. If it's a visiting professor from Amsterdam, okay, that's all right. But to have huge swaths of your population, farm workers, tech workers, and others, be indentured servants who can't join a union, can't vote, and have to go back to their countries if they protest mistreatment by their employers, that's just, it's a form of modern day serfdom.
All right, should we move on to another question? Okay, would you agree that the political philosophies of conservatism and progressivism are both necessary in a healthy society? If so, would you agree that a majority of centrists elected both George W. Bush and Obama? And if so, why do we care about the polarization of the extremes of left and right?
I'll question the premises of that. In 1990, I spent a winter vacation skiing in Gstaad, Switzerland with William F. Buckley Jr., Mr. Conservative, and his best friend, John Kenneth Galbraith, Mr. Liberal. And having worked with liberals and conservatives over most of my life, my own view is that the American public is not actually divided into these categories. It's a reflection of our two-party system, which in return is a reflection of our electoral rules. As some of you, maybe most of you know, in our system of first past the post elections, which we share with Britain, but which most democracies abandoned generations ago, whoever wins the plurality of the vote in a single member district, wins that office, governor, president, mayor, whatever, even if most of the people voted against that person in a 3 or 4 way race. Where you have proportional representation, and we don't need to go into the details here, you can have multiple parties representing the actual viewpoints, not perfectly, otherwise every person would have his or her own party, but the larger values and interest communities in the population. And my guess is that if we had proportional representation in the US, you wouldn't have just Republicans and Democrats or liberals and conservatives. You would have, there'd be a populist party, be fairly substantial, maybe 30, 40% of the population. It would be kind of Trumpy. It would in terms of their goals, be kind of socially conservative, very pro-Social Security, pro-Medicare, pro-labor in some ways. There would be a libertarian party. There would be, some kind of centrist, Bush Republican, Clinton Democrat party. So there'd be 3 or 4 parties. And the second part of the very, very intelligent question that I want to push back on is, I don't like this idea of center and extremes, because it presupposes a line where you can put everybody at the same point on a line. It's more like a circle where the extremes meet, or I don't know, like a kaleidoscope where they're shifting coalitions. So if you look at this payroll retention program in Congress, some of the most progressive policies have been coming out of Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri, Marco Rubio of Florida, and they've been applauded by progressive Democrats for policies that the Democrats think are more progressive than those of Pelosi and Schumer. So I just think that the problem with our system is we actually have a 4 or 5 party population, which is artificially herded into a unnatural and 2-party system.
Well, we have a question that kind of follows up on that. How would a multi-party system develop from what we have now? It can't come from within one of the 2 parties, because that party would never win again if fractured. It would have to come from alliances across the 2 parties, and I don't see any natural alliances that would form in that way.
Yeah, that's been the problem that we at Fair Vote, as the staff and those of us, I was on their board for a number of years, have been wrestling with since we founded Fair Vote in 1992. The majority party is never going to change the rules. And then if the party that was outsiders, then they win, then they think, hey, we won. System can't be that bad, right? So there are different routes you can do this. One is in the US, it could be imposed by the courts, because we have very strong federal courts. And for example, as a desegregation measure, you can say that our party system, and I think you can demonstrate this, tends to increase racial polarization, just because people are clustered in particular neighborhoods, and then those neighborhoods are gerrymandered. So it's been suggested now and then that the courts order multi-party districts, multi-member districts that could be multi-party districts, as a solution to racial and other kinds of gerrymandering. This has never gotten anywhere, and I think it's unlikely to succeed, given the rather conventional politics of most Democrats and Republicans in the federal judiciary. Plan B is, or maybe it's Plan A, is to move towards a full multi-party democracy in the US by little baby steps, beginning with changing the way we elect people to single member offices, where there can only be one winner. So just to be clear, in a real multi-party system, at least the lower house of the legislature should be elected by multi-member districts, right? So if let's say Travis County area sends 4 members to the House of Representatives, under the plurality system, if whoever wins the plurality could dominate all 4. So a party that only represents half or a quarter of the population could end up, just through electoral math, and having all 4 seats. But let's say Travis County is divided between, it's a fairly liberal county, let's say 50% liberals, 50% Republican, or 25% Republicans, 25% Greens, okay? So if you have the 4-member Travis County delegation in the House, then maybe you get 2 Democrats, 1 Republican, and 1 Green, right? And so that's the ultimate goal, in my view. I mean, I don't think you succeed in electoral reform unless you have multi-member districts. But how to build up a constituency for this? Well, beginning with San Francisco and Cambridge, and now in the state of Maine, Fair Vote and other allied organizations have persuaded voters in ballot initiatives to adopt ranked choice voting, or instant runoff voting, which kind of simulates this for single member districts. So, and again, not to get into the details, but under ranked choice voting, a vote for a third party candidate is not a throwaway vote, where you hurt the other party candidate most close to you, and you end up electing the person you hate the most. Since if somebody doesn't get 50% of the initial vote, then the second and third choice votes of other voters are reassigned. It's like a runoff, except it's done mathematically. by computers instead of on a separate day, sometimes later among the top two. So you reassign second and third choice votes until you have a majority winner of first and second, or et cetera votes. The reason that could create a constituency for radical electoral reform over time is you can then have third parties which are not spoilers, right? And they can really be players, and they can be national parties, right? It's not just like Ralph Nader accused of throwing the election to George W. Bush anymore, right? And those third parties, even if they're small parties, they can be the kingmakers or the queenmakers in particular races. So, you know, it would take time, maybe a decade or a generation, but even if you still had a plurality voting system, the third and fourth and fifth parties could have enough clout. They could force the Democrats and Republicans, you know, to move towards multi-member districts, maybe in legislatures. It's, you know, who knows? It's very difficult to change any system, and then, you know, the Senate, we can talk about that, you know, the territorial malapportionment in the Senate. But I think that's probably the most realistic way forward. It's to have one state after another follow Maine in adopting ranked choice voting. And then a generation later, the newly empowered third parties basically blackmail the two major parties into going along with electoral reform.
Well, that makes sense. And you mentioned Cambridge. I believe they've been doing this ranked choice voting since the 40s, and they used the multi-member version of it for their city council. So that's pretty interesting. There were also a lot of other cities in the country in the 20th century that used ranked choice voting, but stopped for various reasons. But our next question comes from Joanne, and it's, because the Republican committee members are term limited, how does this affect their efforts to control the House? This is one reason why many Republicans have retired this session.
That's a good question. I don't know the answer in particular. You know, I think, you know, all term limits tend to shift power in Washington away from the term limited people to the people who don't have term limits, who tend to be lobbyists and donors, right? So I think one of the I've always been against term limits but also staffers, right? So if you're a staffer on Capitol Hill and you're 40 or 50 years old and you've been there for decades and you know far more about how it works than your recently elected member of Congress who will be term limited out, you know, in that case, knowledge is power. So you know, in my view, you actually want career public servants. It's not a bad thing having the same individual, you know, in a particular committee chair or an agency over, you know, years or decades. There's this kind of naive populist assumption that those people will be corrupt. Well, maybe they will be, but actually a weak, recently elected member of Congress who doesn't know, you know, how things work is probably more dependent on donors and lobbyists, you know, than some wily old survivor, right? You know, who when somebody comes into the office and tries to play games with them, they say, well, I remember that trick from 36 years ago, right? So, so I can't answer that specific questions about the committee chairs being term limited, but so I substituted a rant against term limits in general.
Okay. Here's another question. How do you assess the roles of, number one, identity politics, such as Ezra Klein in his new book, Why We're Polarized, and number two, religious fundamentalism, such as Jeff Charlet's focus on the family, and DeVos and Pence, etc., in class warfare?
Well, there's always been identity politics going back to the beginning of the country, where you know, the big battles in the 19th century were, well, obviously there was racism, you know, which is endemic, anti-Black racism in particular, but also anti-Catholicism. That was a big divide, as you recall from the movie Gangs of New York. It was the Protestants versus the Catholics. You had prohibition was a huge social issue for most of American history, really, up until the 1930s. It was kind of like the drug war and the abortion issue and things like that. So the thing is, there are always going to be these deep religious and racial and ethnic and regional cleavages. But then if you look at our 200 some odd years history, at different periods, those have been accommodated, right? And they didn't blow up the system. And in other eras, the system blew up. You had literal civil war, right? Or mass violence, pogroms, lynchings, etc. So my own view is that the way you deal with identity politics is, and of course you have identity, it's legitimate to some degree, right? That is, if you're a Orthodox Jew, right, and you believe the world was, created in 7 days, or a fundamentalist Protestant, you're a citizen. You have a right to teach that to your children and to, have your views respected. If you're a Darwinian atheist, the same. So you have to have some kind of system that accommodates these different groups, which are going to continue living together in the same population. And again, that gets back to electoral reform, but it also gets to power sharing institutions. That is, the more people feel they have a stake, both in the political system, but also in the workplace, in having some influence in school curricula and the media, the less likely they are to kick the Coke machine, right? So instead of, turning the Coke machine over after there's no response, you get enough response from the political system or the social system that you feel like, well, my concerns are being listened to. And here again, going back to unions, I think that the essential disintegration of private sector unions, they've been all but killed off in the US. It's now like 6% of the private sector workforce. This has released a lot of the poisons of identity politics and of religious rivalries, because unions were a unique institution that transcended religion and race and region. They were national unions, right? And I was accused in one of these reviews of my book of ignoring the interests of African Americans by emphasizing class politics, right? So the answer to that is, and indeed I do emphasize class politics and I emphasize unions. The two most important African American civil rights leaders of the 20th century were A. Philip Randolph, a trade union leader, founded the Railroad Porters Union, and Martin Luther King Jr., member of the Christian Church, which is not a race-based church, right? A Protestant evangelical minister who considered going on a joint revival tour in the 1950s with his friend and ally, the Reverend Billy Graham, right? So the difference between the civil rights era and the present is that now both parties, Republicans do this with religious people. They appeal to white resentment to some degree. The Democrats just play the race and ethnicity card frequently, targeting particular populations. And in the absence of these organizations at the grassroots level, which have people of different races and different religions in the same organization, then it's very easy for these, spinmeisters and propagandists, in Washington and New York, and ad agencies and political consultants to micro-target particular groups, right? And I worked, by the way, just to finish up this question, in a stint of unemployment in my youth in Washington, D.C., I worked for a list broker. They were doing this already in the early 1990s. They were dicing and slicing voters into tiny little categories like patriotic grannies, right? Liberal urban hipsters, things like that. They like 30 categories. And they did this on the basis, even with primitive computers, on the basis of like the sort of Sears catalog stuff you bought. This was before Amazon, but it was what you bought and where you lived and your zip code. So we have this system where in the absence of cross-cutting institutions, then the political campaigns micro-target individuals with the most inflammatory ads they can think of targeted to your demographic group.
Well, given your points about international trade being more about arbitrage than comparative advantage, what can you tell us about tariffs?
Well, tariffs are a very blunt instrument, and here's the basic problem that is ignored by most discussions of trade. Most countries have an industrial policy, whether they want to admit it or not. They want to favor certain strategic industries, automobiles, chemicals, information technology, AI, robotics, aerospace, to be either great powers or developed countries. At the same time, you have a trading system which, even if no particular country cheats, will result in them losing some of those industries. So my view is that it's kind of like prohibition. The premise of prohibition was that drinking alcohol is evil, so we're going to outlaw alcohol. And the result was you got Al Capone, organized crime went into the alcohol industry until it was finally repealed. I think we should repeal bans on industrial policy, including industrial policy using protectionist measures, of which tariffs are one, quotas are another, local content provisions are another, and say, look, China, India, EU, US, you want an aerospace industry, you can protect your aerospace providers, that's fine. We don't insist that Boeing make all of the jets in the world and Airbus. Right now there's a Boeing Airbus monopoly in large body jetliners. It's the US and EU because we subsidize them. That China is building up its own aircraft industry, fine. From my perspective, India will want to get in this. Brazil has its own small jetliner industry, which they created through protectionism. So we say, okay, in areas where all major countries want to have producers in the same major industries like aerospace and computers and automobiles, then okay, we'll have managed trade, or we're not going to have pure free trade. In other areas where the countries are not competing with each other in these industries, baseballs, a lot of foodstuffs, oil and gas, we'll have more or less free trade. So I just think we have to be realistic about this and treat trade as a tool of national industrial policy, not just for us, but for our trading partners too. They have their own interests that may differ from ours, fine. And get away from this really academic kind of neoliberal consensus that, any deviation in free trade it shows that either you don't understand Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, or it's going to lead to, disaster and depression. And it just come up with a more practical system where the major industrial countries just negotiate with each other. And sometimes they'll liberalize trade, sometimes they'll be more protective.
Last question. Fake news exacerbates polarization. What would it take to create a news source that would be trusted by people on opposing sides?
Well, I looked into this when I was an editor of Harper's, actually, because I was concerned by the fact-checking process, which consisted of an unpaid intern. And so I asked, what is the rule that something in Harper's Magazine is a fact? And my answer, I was told by the editor at the time, well, if it appears in the New York Times, it's a fact, right? So if the unpaid intern finds it in the New York Times, well, that wasn't satisfactory to me. So for many years, I bored my editors and publishers by saying, why don't we have all of the media pay a fund to a central fact-checking organization, right, where there are checks and balances and so on. And it turns out such an organization exists, and it's an agency of the U.S. government. It's the CRS, the Congressional Research Service. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but they do these incredible reports. The dean of the LBJ school now Angela Evans is a former official at the CRS. So you actually can come up with something like that. I'm not that pleased by most of the fact checking because it does have partisan bias, a lot of it, and that, that the other side calls out. But I think it's possible when it comes to actual facts. But here's why I'm more pessimistic about this being even relevant to polarization, because the big difference in worldviews, in values, is not over whether something is a fact or not. It's over whether it's a problem. Okay? So you may agree that immigration reduces wages, for some workers who compete with immigrants, but you say, well, that's offset by cheaper food for consumers. Okay, well, that's a value judgment that the trade-off goes one way than the other to the consumer rather than the producer. And that's not a matter of fact. So depending on whether you're a egalitarian, a libertarian, a conservative, you're going to look at exactly the same data. You can agree. The cost of the policy is exactly the same. All sides could agree on that. But one side has a different cost-benefit analysis. So I don't think there is an escape to evidence-based policy. Now that's helpful, right? I mean, you want to combat, dangerous falsehoods that are matters of science or technical or engineering fact. But even when you've done all of that, you're still going to have profoundly different moralities of people trying to coexist in the same country. And you have to have a way of accommodating that without civil war.
Great, thank you. People are finding that Zoom meetings have a sweet spot of about an hour in length. Going much longer than that, you start having people drift away. Today, I've been watching the numbers, and because this was such an interesting, wide-ranging conversation, participants online have stayed pretty steady. So thanks to Professor Michael Lind for helping make that happen. This is our first attempt at a Zoom meeting. I think it went very well. And the benefit is now that we do not have to ask you to help put the chairs away afterwards. So yay.
Oh, yeah. And more power to Common Ground for Texas.
Yes. Did we have any comments about next month's meeting yet?
Okay. Yeah, I guess I think I'm unmuted, and I could say that because Michael Lind actually brought this up about details of ranked choice voting, I believe that our March meeting will be, in fact, on ranked choice voting and how it works.
I'm sorry, one second.
Comments from other people who have voted under this kind of system for a while.
That'll be the May meeting.
May meeting.
May meeting, yeah. May meeting.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go raise a toast to avoiding civil war and the fourth republic of the country.
Yeah.
And I do hope that, maybe I'll cross my fingers that we might be able to meet in person in May. I'm not going to hold my breath, however. But thanks so much for everybody who came. There were faces that we have not seen and new folks, and I welcome you all, and thank you, Michael Lind.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye. You too.